and then if you could give your oxygen tanks a stir.
Roger that. Hey, we've got a problem here.
What did you do?
Nothing. I stirred the tanks.
Whoa. Hey. This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
The clip you just heard was from the movie Apollo 13 starring Tom Hanks. Although the movie is not exactly correct, we thought it would help all of you understand what really happened on the spacecraft. Today, many see Apollo 13 mission as a failed exploration of space. However, contrary to popular belief, it improved our ability to exchange knowledge about the dangers of space and how to escape encounters with deadly problems millions of miles from home.
The primary crew for the Apollo 13 mission included James Lovell as commander, Kenneth Mattingly II as commander module pilot, and Fred Haise as the lunar module pilot, the LEM. However, when the backup LEM pilot contracted rubella, Kenneth Mattingly was dismissed from the primary crew due to the fact that he had never had the disease before and therefore was not immune to it. Replacing him was lunar module pilot Jack Swigert from the backup crew.
On April 11, 1970, at 1:13 p.m., Apollo 13 took flight. The astronauts' wives were extremely fearful of the potential danger due to the superstitions regarding the number 13. However, they had faith in NASA and their husbands to complete this mission safely and successfully.
About 5.5 minutes after takeoff, the first problem of the spaceflight occurred. The crew felt a little vibration right before the center engine of the S2 stage shut down 2 minutes early. This caused the remaining 4 engines to burn 34 seconds longer than expected, and the SIVB third stage had to burn 9 seconds longer to put Apollo 13 in orbit. This occurrence was scary, but did not appear to be life-threatening. The crew hoped this was the only problem they would encounter.
Fred Haise was quite the jokester and wanted to keep everyone aboard entertained and enjoying the ride. So when there was an explosion in Oxygen Tank 2, the men thought it was just Haise playing tricks with the pressure valve again. Unfortunately, the explosion was just the beginning of all the troubles they would encounter on this flight.
Take notice that the explosion occurred on April 13, 1970, when Jack Swigert flipped the switch that would mix the liquid oxygen in the tanks. Come to find out, there was faulty wiring inside Oxygen Tank 2, so when Swigert stirred the tanks, it created a spark. It was when the spark reacted with the liquid oxygen that the explosion occurred. However, since the force of the explosion was so great, it severely damaged the other tanks, leaving the Apollo 13 crew completely out of oxygen and rocketing away from Earth at 2,000 miles per hour.
Now that they had an understanding of the difficult conditions they would face, the astronauts realized they had many critical decisions to make. The first, however, was oxygen.
The crew knew what had to be done to get them home. They would have to use the lunar module as a lifeboat for oxygen. They had practiced this procedure in simulation, but never expected that they would actually have to do it. Since the lunar module couldn't penetrate the Earth's atmosphere to get them home, they would have to shut down the entire command module and live solely off the LEM until it was time to return home. The crew's most significant challenge was to power down the command module before the battery ran out, and to power up the lunar module before the oxygen ran out. It was a race against time, and luckily the men were successful in completing both tasks.
The next decision the crew would have to make was whether or not to take the long or short way home. It seemed like the short way, also known as the direct deport, which would take them to the moon and turn them around to come home, was the obvious decision. However, there was a major problem which led to the consideration of taking the long way, which would take them around the backside of the moon and slingshot them back in the direction of the Earth. The short route would take a day and a half, whilst the long would take 4. The problem with the short way home was that it would require the use of the main engine, which was one nearest the explosion. If that engine were to fail, the consequences would be detrimental. The flight director was faced with a big decision, but he seemed to believe the best idea would be to take the long way home and face problems like hunger and lack of water, then risk the use of the main engine. The LEM module was designed for 2 men for 2 days, and the crew of Apollo 13 consisted of 3 men, and all the supplies would need to last them double the time they were intended to. The decision was final, and once conveyed to the crew, the men geared up knowing it would be a long and trying 4 to 5 days.
The most miraculous portion of the trip for the crew was their ability to see the backside of the moon. They were the first men to get to experience it and are still the only ones who have ever seen it to this day.
The ride was extremely trying for the men. They were basically running a bare bones operation and had to shut down almost anything that would use power because they would need all the power they could store simply to return home. The men of Apollo 13 were extremely thirsty, hungry, cold, and tired. The crew had the opportunity to sleep in shifts, however, due to their nerves regarding the flight, none of them were able to get much rest.
They were not only cold, hungry, and tired, but an invisible killer threatened the men's lives. Their own exhalation was creating so much CO2 that the air purifier was unable to keep up. Keep in mind that there is more men aboard than the engineers intended, and they are also using the ship double the length of time they were supposed to. The dead command module held filters that the astronauts could retrieve, however they were square apparatuses, and the opening for air purifiers in the LEM was circular. To prevent the CO2 from killing the men, the engineers in the control center had to work feverishly to make an adapter out of only the items the men had on board to make the new filter fit. Once the control center had made a mock-up of the adapter, they had to convey to the crew exactly how to build it over the radio. Miraculously, the men were able to understand what the engineers were saying and save themselves from excessive CO2. Unfortunately, this would not be the last of their problems.
As the men began to see Earth through their LEM window, they received another radio call from the control center. They told the crew that they had extrapolated their course and realized that the spacecraft would come in too shallow and it would hit Earth's atmosphere, bounce off, and be lost in space. They now had to think of a solution to change the trajectory of the spaceship so it would come in at just the right angle. However, this was a very complicated maneuver due to the risk of coming in too steep and burning up. The engineers calculated the direction and the exact amount of rocket thrust the men would need to put themselves back on the course. However, the crew had to make it happen and was forced to do everything manually. They would follow the instructions for when to fire the thrusters and would have to modify their direction based on how they saw Earth through the small windows of the lunar module. The crew of Apollo 13 completed this tricky task like they had done it many times before.
Now, just hours from Earth on Friday, April 17th, the crew had to resituate back into the command module to prepare for their return through the atmosphere. However, since the command module had been shut down for days, the engineers on the ground were working feverishly to think of a smart way to boot it up again. This was the first time a command module had ever been shut down in flight and would be forced to restart on battery power. If the battery died, so did the crew. The procedure for restarting the module was 500 steps long, and 3 cold, hungry, and tired men would have to execute it perfectly because their lives depended on it. Luckily, the module powered right up, which was a huge relief to the crew. The last thing that could possibly go wrong is if the heat shield was damaged in the explosion. However, if it was, they would have no way of knowing until the rocket burnt up during re-entry.
On April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 plunged back into the Earth's atmosphere. However, the 5,000-degree fireball surrounding the rocket blacked out all radio transmissions. The crew of Apollo 13 was literally flying solo. The blackout was expected to last 4 minutes. However, after that time was up, the clock was ticking and there was still radio silence from Apollo 13. About a minute and a half went by before the world could feel relief upon hearing Jack Swiggert's radio response to the control center saying, "Okay, Joe." The crew splashed into the oceans of the South Pacific, and Jim Lovell told the crew happily, "Hey, we're home."
To this day, no human beings have ever ventured farther from home, and no astronauts have ever overcome so many disasters in one flight as the crew of Apollo 13. It is an unbelievable story about bravery, intelligence, and the strength of teamwork. This mission will forever be the most successful spaceflight in the history of space exploration.